Great on the cocoa flavor wheel.
Yeah, I can smell cocoa.
Wheel,
I'm happy to help with the wine wheel anytime.
Yeah, no, it's.
We were talking in Indonesia once about the coffee Q grader training where you have to like have all the different scents, and they had to like bring blueberries with them and like certain flavors that like it's not very easy to find in, you know, Aceh, Indonesia. And so like the different things that they brought along for the training so that the farmers would.
They had trouble getting them through customs.
You know, I didn't ask. It's like one of those things where you're like, maybe nobody knows. Okay. We'll go ahead and get started. I don't actually know exactly how many people I'm supposed to expect, but it's a lot of information, and so I will also send out an email and more guidance and information. It's very short, so I'm going to stop here. Not that I need to be tall, but. So thank you all for your interest and for coming. As I mentioned in my email, I was in Torino, Italy, at the ILO, the International Labour Organization, which is part of the United Nations, for those who aren't familiar, in September for a week-long course on value chain development. And this actually arose initially because they also do a course specifically around value chain development for refugee populations. And I had tried to go to that course, but the timing was terrible and we were short in reaching out, and it didn't work. And they were like, well, we have this other course coming up. It's similar. It's a little bit more broad. We'll still touch on the refugee stuff, but it's also for development. And I was like, well, we do both, so why not? And so the course itself was taught by 4 different trainers. 2 of them came from Africa, 1 from Latin America, and 1 was a German guy who had worked in a lot of different humanitarian situations. And it included a day of field visits to 2 different locations. So we spent half the day visiting a large cooperative, like 5 farms with 12 affiliate farms. And then we went to a grocery store called Italy, like eat and Italy merged together. They have them in the U.S. There's one in Chicago and one opening in New York and one in L.A. But they're quite popular in Italy. And so we were looking at all of, good point, all of the elements around, sorry. All of the elements around the supply chain, because that cooperative, in addition to selling to people at home, selling from their own properties, et cetera, also happened to be integrated into the supply chain of Italy. So we were able to kind of continue to follow them second half of our site visit day. So I want to start. I have a lot of different resources. I tried to condense some of it, so you're going to get the highlights, but if you're interested in a particular aspect of what I'm going to talk about, I have all the PowerPoints, all the handouts, massive case study, like reading log of 50 plus documents if anybody wants to really dig into some of this stuff. And it's all included. The ILO has like an e-campus, so you can just go in and download resources at any time, as much as you want. It's all searchable. Very impressive training.
Who were the participants? Was it mostly NGOs? Were you an outlier, or?
I was definitely an outlier. I was the only American, which was a little unique. They are not all NGOs. I would say there were 4 other people from NGOs. 1 person who works for Aga Khan in Afghanistan, 2 people from CARE in different countries, and 1 person from Save the Children Italy. So she kind of works on value chain for certain countries that are connected, like affiliated through the Confederation with the Italy Save the Children. And then the rest, there was a group of UN staff, like scattered from different countries. Some worked for ILO, some worked for UNDP, some worked for specific projects that the UN were implementing. There was a woman who worked at the IAEA, of all things, who manages procurement for the IAEA and was interested in better understanding the value chain, because apparently they buy a lot of things in these different countries that the IAEA is responsible for some of the nuclear works. That was really random, but interesting. And then there were also
International Atomic Energy.
Yes, International Atomic Energy Agency. That buys like beakers for, random developing countries. And then there were also people from private sector. So 2 guys from a construction company, a woman who runs her own business in Ramallah. Yeah, it was a very diverse group. But I would say I was definitely the outlier of being like more traditional NGO and also being from the US. I got a lot of questions about our president and a lot of questions about North Korea because it was right when all that was going down. They were like, so do you think there will be war? And I was like, oh jeez.
Can you
Like,
say
it's likely.
beyond the current 7 war?
It made for a really fun time. And of course getting to know everybody. Learned a lot about different UN bodies, which I did not have as much experience with or exposure. So I want to start just very briefly with terminology, because, and I've noticed this a little bit when we talk to some of our private sector partners, but the difference of kind of what is the core value chain, what is the market system, what is a supply chain versus a value chain, all of that sort of stuff. We spent a little bit of time sort of digging into it, but really supply chain and value chain development is really just the perspective you're coming from. So the language that we use as the development community is all about the value chain, because we're talking about what is the value for the farmer, or what is the value for the community. And supply chain tends to be what a multinational or what a corporation is using. When we talk about what is the core value chain, it's this kind of dotted box of the sourcing, which for us would be the farmers and the communities, the production, which may be at the farm level, maybe the post-harvest production, which is perhaps removed from the farmers we work with, depending on what the supply chain is, what the commodity or what the item is, and then the marketing, which may even then be further along until you get to that end market, which is normally, but not necessarily. It could be the domestic end market. But basically, this was originally conceived to express the activities that added value to a product or a service. And for the development community, we were really looking at goals such as poverty reduction and job creation, and so it was really the value of it. So as that, yes, here's your core value chain in that one. And then added to that, they added market systems development. And this was part of an evolution of an organization known as the Springfield Center, making markets work for the poor, which I think is a term that some people in kind of the development speak know, but trying to look more at who are all these market players and what are their supporting functions to the core value chain. So who else is involved, and understanding the other market actors so that you can get a sense of the constraints, who else needs to be integrated and involved, and what are the other things that are kind of being fed into your core value chain. And then they call it the donut, which I thought was a really funny term, but it's kind of donut-ish on the picture, a donut without a hole maybe, like a donut. But then you get kind of where the nonprofits and the business organizations also come in, and other rules and regulations. So you have information coming in, you have sort of the standards, which a lot of times are set specific to a commodity or specific to a value chain, as well as governing laws, which maybe have nothing to do with a specific value chain, but govern kind of actions, all impacting that core value chain. So when we talk about market system development or market systems analysis, which is the term that the UN used was when they talk about value chains, this entire group of actors and situations is what they're looking at. And I think for LWR, at least, one of the things that was most interesting to me as we sort of went through our discussion is that I think a lot of times the scope of our assessments, particularly when we're doing project design, is perhaps not as inclusive or not as broad as we may think it is, or as we may be. Like the number of people we're talking to and the number of sort of angles at which we're trying to analyze our value chain where we're working is perhaps not as broad as others like the UN or others doing large market system program. I'll touch on that a little bit more. Yeah, go ahead, one. Sorry.
Just overcome.
You have to chew the food first.
For the projects that happen in Asia, could you point to where you think we do focus on in our needs assessment and kind of
Yeah.
what we leave out? Just
Sure. So I think in my region, we are very good at understanding the rules and regulations, and we're very good at understanding some of the initial related services and the initial kind of infrastructure that supports. I don't think we look at what other bodies are doing, whether they're government or non-government, around research and development very often, and this has come up a lot, particularly when we talk about coffee and cocoa and like what is the government's push on new varieties, or what is the R&D coming out of such and such academic institution in another country or something like that, and what will that filter down eventually to our value chain. And I also think that so again, it's the ILO and they do a lot of stuff with like unions, but they had a big focus on your membership organizations, which for us I think is oftentimes the co-op or the farmer group. Business membership organizations, I think we're starting to look at more, but we haven't done as much. But again, the size of your program, the scale of your program, as you look more at national type levels, I think we're fine in reaching out to the government and kind of understanding the local actors. But again, it was kind of where is your analysis kind of focusing, and what might you be leaving out that then later should be factored into like.
Can I make a comment? I mean, this is really interesting to me because I think this is what we're doing, at least for the USDA opportunities. And I can't speak for SP, like when they did the Sesame one, but my understanding talking to Chelsea is that they were interviewing pretty much all these different actors. And similarly, we did that in Honduras last year, and we're doing it now for the new regional thing. But I like this because it's like, when we like talk through the TOR and the scope of work, like we knew that this was like we have a consultant doing this basically right now. But we didn't. Having this is like a really nice way to visualize it.
Yeah,
like the information you need.
They have a lot of great visuals, and I copied many of the slides, but not all of them. Yeah, Paul, go ahead.
Talked about this as you go forward, but for me, it is, I understand it's just schematic, like a category. But our co-ops are both worker employee member organizations. Farmers we're working with are in fact small businesses. I see the ILO focus on worker, again, the ILO kind of mandate, the tripartite work between state and company, private sector company workers. I don't see that in many of the countries that we work. So for me, it looks fundamentally flawed. It's a good way to pick apart the pieces, but I mean, does that come up later? That frankly, that
not as much, and that's
describe the world that we work in.
Well,
never mind the politics of it.
And I do think that was one of the things that came up when you talked about, when Michael mentioned about who was in this training, is that the approach or the level at which we're analyzing is definitely, I would say, a leg up from where LWR typically works. Like the farmer is in this, but we're not supposed to target the farmer. And I'll talk about that a little bit because both I and the Italian woman from Save the Children had a really rough day one day when we just constantly went back and forth with two of the facilitators, like, but how are you helping the farmer? And they're like, well, if you help the market will help the farmer. And I'm like,
not necessarily.
So it was a good conversation in terms of like, one, to understand the mindset about how this, sort of approach is supposed to work in the ideal world, but then also what does that leave out in some of your other approach. But yes, I'll touch on that a little bit more. So that's terminology related. Process-wise, this is the way that they define sort of the value chain development process. And this is not the only time we'll see this because I'll kind of come back because we hit different places. But the first is understanding your sector and your value chain selection. The second is doing your actual market system analysis. Third is around the intervention design. So very similar to are like, what are you designing as your program? Fourth, implementation, and then scale up. And again, here the emphasis for them is very much on the fact that if it is a good design, the market will scale it itself. We should not be relying on new donor money or on something else to scale it. That if it's truly sustainable, it will scale on its own. And then monitoring and results measurement. And I'm not going to share as much about this one. Sorry to Wendy and Garrett. The monitoring and results measurement part was interesting, but it's also not necessarily, I think, as revolutionary for us. There are some interesting resources that they have about it that I'll touch on, but I'm not going to spend.
That's not a sorry thing, Nicole. That's great. It's not revolutionary for us.
Yeah. There was a lot of like, okay, yeah, no, that's fine. So from a sector and value chain perspective, I think, this is stuff that we do already. Many thanks to Logan, and for folks on the phone, I'll email this when I send around the PowerPoint, but I wanted to share with you all, and it's, actually, I'll just kind of split them in half and then you can send around. This is a multi-page resource that they use. So they're folded such in a way that you can kind of look at it. The actual handout has different colors, but one of the things that they talked a lot about was how you're selecting your sectors and starting out kind of large. So if you want a project that has 2 value chains in it, you should be doing an analysis and a sector selection process of 4. Or if you want a program in which you're doing 5, you need to start with an analysis of 10 so that you're really getting a really broad view to then make your selection. And their criteria is this handout, and it's a lot of different questions based around these 4 dimensions. So the institutional dimension, economic dimension, social dimension, and environmental. And the idea, and we did several different exercises, but the idea is that you should be saying, okay, if I'm looking at, ecotourism, construction, dairy value chain, and cacao, for example, and I'm going to pick 2 of those, or 1 of those, to be kind of my main thrust for my program, you then look at each of these dimensions and pick out 2 or 3 framing questions that you want to utilize for your value chain analysis. So the criteria, and it's in this handout, but I'll send it around. It's, questions that you would want to ask to better understand particular impacts or references. If you have a focus on youth, for example, some of those questions are more targeted around youth or vulnerable populations. Some of them have more of an angle around policy if you're trying to get more at this kind of institutional advocacy side of things. But the idea was that they've come up, and this is an ILO diagram here, but they came out with sort of, these are the 4 dimensions from which we should be analyzing the sectors and kind of defining our objectives, defining our target group, developing the criteria from which we will be eventually selecting the value chain that will work. We talked a little bit in the training because, again, this assumes that you have the choice of which value chain you're working. And you don't always have the choice, as we know. Sometimes the donor is like, we're looking for someone to work in pulses and that they're lentils, and that's what you're going to do, regardless of whether that's where the intervention should be or not. One of the trainers was a consultant from South Africa, and he had done a lot of work in this kind of value chain analysis and market sector selection. And he said that a lot of the sort of negotiations that he's been a part of is where if you feel strongly enough that the donor has chosen the wrong value chain, or that you've gotten a little bit into your analysis that you have the wrong value chain, being able to rely on these tools and frame a conversation about why you think it should be something different, he said has worked about 60% of the time in his experience.
That's interesting.
I think this is actually interesting as we talk about how do we engage in when USAID is actually developing their programs, when they're asking for feedback. Having this information can obviously influence a country's strategy for USAID as well. And so if we had that in our hip pocket, I think it could be really powerful.
Yeah, and I think that, one of the things that we discussed a lot in our training was sort of like, at what point are you doing this analysis? Because ideally you're not doing it after you've won an award. You are trying to kind of position yourself around something or select things. Maybe this is the way that LWR is trying to utilize more of our unrestricted, to have these assessments and kind of ready to go to inform what we want to do. But I think that, it was more encouraging, I think, than several of us were sort of saying, like, okay, this is nice, but like we don't. Yeah. That you can kind of try and negotiate and analyze. And he said the same is true with government. A lot of times the government has its priority focus areas, and you have to work with them or to work with whatever government research institute there is that does these market studies, and to use that. And just to give you a sense, that sector selection, like these handouts, actually come from a book that the ILO publishes that's like 20 pages. So there's a lot of material on just that aspect. And he said that a lot of times that's what they use and they reference when they're trying to have those conversations. So now you're at the market systems analysis. So you've chosen what your sector is, you've chosen your value chain, and are kind of moving into what we discussed, which was value chain mapping. I put up multiple visuals just to give you a sense of how different and diverse these can look. So this is an aquaculture.
Wait.
No, wait.
No, sorry.
Aquaculture. This one, I'm trying to remember. Soy? I think it was soybeans. Then this one was an example that they gave us from Mercy Corps. And coffee in Western Uganda. I mean, it was just, they ranged, and what was really fun is in the training, of course, we got to use Legos and flip charts and sticky note, everything you could possibly imagine when you're like facilitating. But they are messy. I mean, and I don't think that that's a huge shock to us, but I think going through the process, and in particular, I think the Mercy Corps one is probably the best for keeping it kind of clean, but trying to understand where you are along each step and drawing those linkages and identifying, okay, like from the small producers, 50% of it goes here, 20% of their product goes there, 10, like where are the different divisions? And it gets really tricky. We, in our training course, I mean, part of, like, what do you do for 5 days? You spend entire days doing different case studies and examples and mapping this and trying to identify, and then over top of that, layer things like vulnerability and marginalization criteria. So understanding power, understanding gender, understanding risks, you talk about like natural floods, hazards, all of those things that you then have to somehow overlay on something like this. And have that discussion. Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to make a quick comment that, the complexity of the work, not only in value chains, is one of the real difficulties that we have in designing good projects, right? And I think a lot of times it's how do you visualize those? Because we understand that things are complex. We want to simplify things, but we also want to capture the complexity. And I like some of those maps. I think we need to, in a way, become a little bit more accustomed with the complexity of the work that we do and not try to simplify everything too much, but you can simplify it after you've captured the complexity. I think when we simplify it too quickly, we miss a lot of things, including the assumptions and some of the key linkages. And I want to come back at some point in time, just as I mentioned, to look at Kumu again, because I think that some of those software that they're developing out there now is really powerful, because you can see what are the key nodes in a lot of these maps and different things like that can help us actually visualize these things with not just having to use a PowerPoint or Excel spreadsheet. So
I also think, I don't think you were in the room when Alex, the guy who did our DFID training, he was using also a sort of way of connecting different things. Conversation went on and you could like thumbs up or red light something or light bulb for an idea, etc. And to me, being a remote person for the training, it was really nice to kind of get that very active.
It was a software that he was using?
Yeah, it's open source something. I don't remember what it was. But.
And he sent us the link to it, but I just haven't had a chance to distribute it.
But I agree, it is something where I think we can definitely do more. Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was gonna say, I think it could be a really useful tool for the technical design workshops. Talked about that, like with looking at but that we still struggle with, like what's the most effective way to.
Yeah.
This might be an interesting way to think about it. Although having said that, then it goes back to the whole thing of like, how much do you reinvent the wheel when the donor has already done this?
Right. Yeah, and
like
to what extent are we...
our phase tend to have like the full analysis already done for you. So then, I think there's value to like, again, questioning it and making sure, like validating what they do.
Well, in a way, if you have that in your hip pocket, you're thinking about it from a country level strategy as well. That these are essentially saying that we're going to do value chain work. What are the what are the value chains that are out there, and which one do we fit most closely with? And it may be you do the analysis and you have a couple of these, but you can dive deeper into the one that USAID comes out with if that's the case, right? So it's putting the upfront work, I think, from a country perspective.
And there's also, I think, a real skill in being able to facilitate that sort of conversation. I mean, that was one of the things that I get really into the weeds if you're not careful.
That's the thing, and it really takes like a talented person to be able, and that's what I feel like, for our technical design workshops, we need like to train people who can do it really well, because otherwise
development with SP today about that, so.
Excellent. So anyway, so this was then sort of the next step. So you have this value chain mapping that you're doing, and then you overlay kind of your additional analysis. So what are the other criteria that you're looking at? In our case, a lot of times we're talking about marginalization, vulnerabilities, whether it's sort of social systems, or if we're talking mental, gender, all of those dynamics get kind of added in. There we go.
I think there was a comment from Mike Johnson.
Yes, I read it, but I didn't read it out loud, sorry. Mike noted that it's also important for someone like myself to understand what LWR is adding to the chain. So where we fit in. Which is also actually, Mike, a really interesting point that I'll get to. Because technically LWR should not be in there. That was a key point that they made over and over again. Not anywhere in. And I know that Rick Hellett probably feels very strongly that's not true, and I think that there is. But it was, again, kind of an interesting thing where we had a lot of really good dialogue.
Sorry, they say assume that development actors like LWR are not present in the system.
That we should not be there.
Right.
You should not be there.
That for us to be a market player is incorrect. Because we are creating a distortion in the market that is artificial. We don't have a business objective. If we are there, then when we leave, whatever we did was unsustainable. And that we need to be a facilitator. I'll get more to it.
There will be, yeah.
Yes.
So, yeah.
It was
And what is it?
contentious,
Right?
but I agree.
I mean, I think this is what we
Hey, so
Go ahead.
this is Rick Hellett. I
Right on you.
guys, we're driving into Kampala together with Kenneth right now, and we're broadcasting you over a little Bluetooth speaker here in the car, and we're engaged. Like, we've been talking about the things you've been talking about as you've been going. But I missed that, and I'm really curious. Do you think that we should not be skewing the markets, or we should be actively involved in the markets?
No, I was saying, I think from your perspective, when we're actually owning equity in a company, we are part of the market, whether LWR, ground up, or however you want to define it, but not as an NGO, we should be in the market, but that when we are actively engaged with a company, we are, of course, a market player.
Yeah, and I think we should be skewing the market on a commercially sustainable basis in favor of, the people that in whose interests we're working, right? So, the most successful financiers often skew the market. Like, they find an advantage and they affect the market to their benefit, and we should be doing the same thing. So great, thank you.
Sure. No, good to hear from you. So moving into the intervention side, I made PowerPoint and then it goes away. Okay. So there were 5 criteria that we spoke about to design our actual interventions. And I'm not going to go too much into each of these, but systemic action, looking at the entire system, sustainable change, so trying to, again, kind of re-emphasize who is the market player. It has to be driven by them. There's ownership by them. I'll get into that a little bit more in a little bit, because this idea of our facilitative role and the ownership aspect came up a lot, and I think is really important for LWR to think about. This point about facilitation role, and that we are trying to incentivize, we're trying to catalyze what the market is doing, and we are not ourselves market actors as an NGO. The large scale impact, so again, who is it that's scaling this up? How do you get this kind of crowding in, the market taking your intervention and carrying it forward? And then, of course, that it's demand driven, that it's something where you're identifying a gap in the market and you're working with a company or multiple companies to address that in a way that they are tailored toward them, etc. So I am actually going to very briefly show a YouTube video that they went over, because we spent a day just focusing on understanding this thing called the business model canvas and learning how to use it. And this is why we did our site visits, was because for each site visit we had to develop a business model canvas.
An organization's business model can be described with 9 basic building blocks: your customer segments, your value proposition for each segment, the channels to reach customers, customer relationships you establish, the revenue streams you generate, the key resources and key activities you require to create value, the key partners, and the cost structure of the business model. But it's not sufficient to just enumerate the 9 building blocks. What you really want to do is to map them out on a pre-structured canvas. This is what we call the business model canvas, a tool that helps you map, discuss, design, and invent new business models. Let's briefly go through the 9 building blocks, starting with the customer segments. These are all the people or organizations for which you're creating value. This includes simple users and paying customers. For each segment, you have a specific value proposition. These are the bundles of products and services that create value for your customers. Channels describe through which touchpoints you're interacting with customers and delivering value. Customer relationships outline the type of relationship you're establishing with your customers. The revenue streams make clear how and through which pricing mechanisms your business model is capturing value. Then you need to describe the infrastructure to create, deliver, and capture value. The key resources show which assets are indispensable in your business model. Key activities show which things you really need to be able to perform well. The key partners show who can help you leverage your business model, since you won't own all key resources yourself, nor will you perform all key activities. Then once you understand your business model's infrastructure, you'll also have an idea of its cost structure. So with the business model canvas, you can map out your entire business model in one image. This works for startup entrepreneurs just as well as for the most senior executives.
So, basically, the way that, that this was kind of pitched and discussed to us is that you've done your value chain map. You've identified sort of your point of entry. Are you going to work with a cooperative? Are you going to work with the, the post-harvest processor or the large business that's importing and exporting? Like, where are you going to kind of target your intervention? And then how can you best address what their gaps and their needs are? And the idea is that in order to best address them, you have to have a really clear sense of how they currently operate, what is the current situation, and where, like, what would look different after you've supported them to change or kind of changed the value chain itself. So this is just one example, and I realize it's really hard to see, and I don't expect you to like read it. But the idea is that over the course of discussions with sort of a company or multiple companies, again, depending on what your project is looking at, you're trying to identify all the different areas in which they're working, their suppliers, what is their cost structure, who are they working with, what are the ways in which they are involved in the market, and then where those are problem areas. So where are the pain points, what are the issues where things are breaking down. One thing that they did encourage is that it generally is a lot harder to work at multiple points of the chain. So to work with the cooperative and the exporter, it's not as easy as working with 3 or 4 exporters, even though they're different businesses, but you're working at that one level as opposed to a level here in which there's an intermediary somewhere else that maybe you're not working with, and then another level here up above it. And so it's not impossible, but it does make your project a lot more complex. But the idea is that this is a more visual way, perhaps, of looking at what we would consider to be like an assessment, like an organization assessment or a cooperative assessment when you're trying to identify what are the gaps and needs. I shared this with Rick and Sylvia. I know Sylvia and I've had a chance to chat just a little bit about it. I'm not suggesting that we have to use it for everywhere, but I will say it's one that if you play around with it a little bit, I think it's actually a really useful tool if you're trying to really dig into what are the gaps and the issues where we're at the level that we're working at, which I think for LWR primarily is at the cooperative level, not always, but primarily. And then trying to identify what, where we want to target the intervention. What of these points is going to have the most critical impact or change if we're able to sort of, in order to design our intervention that way.
So when you say that the value proposition would be a value proposition from a cooperative perspective and everything else around it. So the value proposition is very linked in. Well, you have to identify your your point first, and then you assess all of the other stuff around that point.
Yeah, this canvas is for whatever company you're doing. Whether it's the cooperative, whether it's the export or whatever, you're doing this in a way, it kind of guides you through the questions that you need to be asking them, or ideally working with them to complete it or something like that, so that you get the entire picture of how they work in the market.
But it's per company, business model.
Correct, yes.
Per firm.
Yes.
For-profit firm.
Per actor.
Per actor,
Or per
yeah.
actor.
It doesn't have to be a firm.
Exporter, processor, cooperative,
Trader.
trader. You have to look at all those separately, essentially, to understand the whole value chain.
And that's why ideally you're doing this after you've identified at which point you're trying to intervene. Otherwise, you could do many of these. And there's also, of course, the aspect that you have to have a company that wants to work with you and is willing to share this information. Because some of it is, confidential or business, specific. There may be some IP and stuff that they don't necessarily want to share. But you ideally at this point have at least had some initial conversations. You have kind of a little bit more openness on their side and can really touch on those points. So I do want to touch on what I started to mention before about this kind of facilitation role. So as we started to discuss earlier, one of the big points that they were making was specifically about what is your role? You've designed this intervention. What are you doing with the market? And where do you kind of get involved and where do you not? And one of the key points was that we should not be playing a big role. And it was very contentious when we talked like from the NGO perspective and her perspective about brand and visibility, et cetera, is that LWR shouldn't own a program. We should keep our visibility really low, if existing at all. And that kind of the, even same thing for the donor, like the idea of ownership being very much put on our private sector partners. So I'll run down these really quickly. The clear and specific, I think we know this, like dropping development jargon, using the language of the private sector, speaking to them, about kind of where their needs are. The recommendations, the two folks from Africa had both worked on two really large scale market facilitation programs. And they said, in our program, we got different business cards that just had the name of the project. So their project was called Yapasa. So nobody introduced themselves with their organization. They had different titles that reflected the titles of the people that they were meeting. So instead of program manager, they were account manager and portfolio developer and kind of, again, using those titles. They didn't give introductions of themselves and their organizations. They started immediately with their pitch. And then kind of eventually, when they got to the questions, worked back and kind of said, oh yeah, and we're working with the UN on this and this, that, and the other, to kind of, again, make it more about business and not as much about a project. Working with influencers and innovators, I don't think that that's a big surprise for us when we talk about that. You want to work with the people that will try something new. The largest companies may be easier to get something to scale, but they might be harder to innovate, might be less interested in changing. Smaller firms want to get into the market, and so therefore might be places that we want to look at more. Lines in the sand was really more a reference of being firm, because I think a lot of times they were coming from the position that we don't necessarily introduce ourselves as an equal partner. We might go to the private sector more with almost like we're begging, please involved here. You need to have a strong position and kind of assume that you are bringing value to them and pitch it as though you are bringing value to them, and not necessarily that, oh, we desperately need a private sector partner. Kind of that mentality shift in terms of how you pitch. The idea of no right way is basically just how do we work within the market. There's no specifically right way to do it. It's going to depend on every value chain, on every market, but nowhere in the market should be found. How will the market behave after we've left? It should act that way. So we don't, train them ourselves. We stay on the outside. We work with services and companies, but we don't ourselves become those services and companies. The ownership at every step. So this was, again, this question of whose project is it? It's not LWR's project and our, sort of staff that have this kind of sense of ownership, but that you want the member of the value chain that owns it, that drives it. They own the problem, and they should therefore own the solution, and that's a bit of a psychological shift. But I think, again, again, the idea is how can we as LWR help solve your, whoever, if you're ecom, olam, exporting, coffee, your problem. And if your problem is supply, if your problem is production, if it's quality, whatever, identifying that and then framing the conversation that way. Low or no visibility. This one, me and the folks from Care and Save definitely talked about a lot. Like, how do you educate your donor so that they don't need to slap their brand on everything? Have the conversation internally that you don't feel like you constantly have to just be promoting yourself. We talked a lot about what are commercial transactions and where are the places where companies actually do put their brand versus the times in which bother because it's just a transaction and it doesn't matter who it is. In terms of rebranding the project, as I mentioned, you don't come from your organization, you come from a particular initiative, and keeping a low profile, especially at initial meetings. So again, I think this is quite common in a lot of the countries we work. People hear NGO or they hear project, they assume that there's going to be some sort of giving or something provided to the community, to the people, and so therefore you get that mindset and there's a bias and expectations of what we're providing. And so really for market development, you have to reduce your NGO-ness and instead kind of just be another market player and a market actor kind of at the table to support them. And then the last one, no free lunch, nothing for free. And this was one where we touched a lot on sort of this conversation with refugees, because you talk about people that come in with literally nothing. So how do you continue to kind of keep that criteria that they use in place? And they said that even the poorest farmer has something. For refugees, a lot of times they build it in after year one. So maybe in the first program, like the first year of the program, you are providing everything and you're starting from scratch because these people have come with nothing. But then in year two, you're expecting them to contribute. We talk a lot about sweat equity. I'm sure the other regions do too. There is always something that people can contribute. And that, again, that ownership, that who is doing it, not coming from the NGO, is, I think, a really critical message that we have changed, I think, as an industry, but not enough to the point that I think they're saying that, there's still an expectation around what we're providing and what we're doing. So related to that, market systems facilitation. So these were sort of the key steps, and this, again, the facilitative mindset. When they say partner, they're not talking about partner like we at LWR think of. Partner is not like your NGO implementer. Partner is the private sector. That was just a slight analogy. So a few suggestions they had, like you could ask private sector partners to apply to you. So if one of the programs they did in Malawi, I think, had a TOR and RFP cycle, and they sent it out, and they had businesses apply for basically like consultative services that this project of the UN was going to offer. But in the TOR, they specify the request, and then what they found is they got a lot more information from businesses because they were applying, and so therefore they're opening their books, they're more sharing in terms of that. So, and also one of the things that came up is that a lot of times these partners should already sort of know who you are, in the sense that you've done your value chain analysis, and when you were doing that, you were likely interviewing them as one of the stakeholders to understand the value chain. So you're not a totally new face, and you had a consultative mentality earlier. You were asking their opinion, asking their advice, so you can continue in that way, rather than approaching them again as the NGO. They gave some examples of different ways in which they frame the conversation. So like we've identified these new opportunities in the marketplace, or looking at kind of the cost structure, trying to make it clear that you know their business model, and getting in that what's in it for me. So those were the main ones there. I know we're getting shorter on time. I'm gonna leave this one. I'll send a slide about this. We talked about working with early adopters and innovators. Again, this, I think, is just, it really depends on the type of program you're working with. We talked about the difference of how you get things to scale, and starting with the folks that are most likely to take something on, the risk takers, the folks who, with a little bit of information, if you do a good, really solid analysis, then you can kind of persuade them to try something new. And then later, the rest of the market, which is the remaining curve there, will start to afterwards. And as we know, leveraging resources, when we talk about scale, how do you get, to your 100,000 farmers from what our resources might be able to provide with 2,000. And that's, again, that shift from direct delivery to facilitation. When we're doing direct delivery, we can probably only reach 1,000 farmers because it costs a lot, as we know, to do the on-farm direct training and all of that sort of stuff. But if you're partnering with firms, if you're impacting that higher level part of the value chain, then they are making a change in their business model that works with everybody that works with them, which will be a much larger number of farmers or fisher folk. Whatever. We talked a little bit about partner criteria. I think that this is very similar to how LWR thinks about our partners. The idea of sort of your high will partners being best bet. You want the people that are eager, the ones that are try things differently. Doesn't necessarily have to be the high skill ones because you may not have high skill ones in some of these countries. But understanding kind of where they fit in this box. And similarly, criteria. So we did role playing and a lot of different case study sort of examples of how you have discussions with private sector partners, how you get to that kind of win-win perspective, talking about the bottom line, talking about the cost structure and the changes that you anticipate based on whatever your market analysis is. So there were a lot of different examples around that. And again, I'm happy to give more resources to people that might be really interested in kind of how you frame those, because I think it is different from, again, the language we use, partners, but getting more at the idea of how are we facilitating. And then in the last area around this portfolio management, so this was more around the M&E and kind of how you look at indicators, where you're looking at the scaling up, what happens after you've demonstrated something successfully. First, there was one slide, and I don't know for the other regions. I know in our region, we're always talking about value for money when we see it as a criteria from a donor, because I don't think we necessarily know it as much. We see it a lot in DFID calls. I'm not sure if others do. But I loved this slide, and when we talked through kind of what does value for money actually look at, this is from Adam Smith, so somebody stole it from a DFID something that they did. But I was like, oh, okay, this actually kind of works for me. But looking a little bit differently at
Adam Smith.
International, large contractor.
I'm talking about 2nd century.
I was thinking.
Sorry, no. Adam Smith International, large. So yeah, something that we can dig in a little bit more, but again, looking at kind of how do we evaluate certain aspects of our program and from a different lens and perhaps from certain mindset. The scaling up aspect, so we talked about kind of the adaptation, or adapting, responding, and expanding. So the ones on the left being what we're doing in our program, where you're piloting things, you're trying to get people to the way that they're working or to adopt something new. And then as there's response on the upper right-hand quadrant, so people that aren't the ones you're directly working with, when they start to change their practices in response to what you are doing. So if we figure out something that works in the marketplace, other market actors will do the same if they need to do so to be competitive. And that's when you start to get to that sort of response level is when it expands. And that's this idea of crowding in the market scale-up version. Last but not least for LWR, and this was, I sat with the folks from Save and Care, our little NGO group, and we talked a little bit about like, what does this mean for your organization? What does it actually change? There's a serious pressure that I think all of us know to deliver results for a program for a donor. And one of the things that we talked about in a couple of the different sessions was that a lot of times direct service delivery is the way to deliver impact. You're like, oh yeah, I did this, we trained these people, they've been trained, they have this new knowledge, one and done, program's over. And that is a change that requires a shift at the donor level in terms of the pressure to deliver results, but also within that kind of negotiating space that as an NGO or a recipient of funds, we also have to kind of take a hard line and have the discussion about what our, long-term impact is versus what are the not falling too much into the direct delivery when we really should be broader facility. The project visibility, I think, is going to continue kind of a question. They pushed really hard on it, and I imagine that there's not a lot of enthusiasm on our side to be like, oh no, we don't need to brand that. Or that we can have different business cards that aren't about LWR, or that we don't introduce LWR per se. Managing risk. So this, again, talks about those early adopters that you're going to work with, the people where you are piloting things in the market that honestly, even the whole idea of shifting kind of our mindset is a risk. Our program staff are not trained that way. It may not work. We may have to hire different people who work in private sector and have that mindset. And I do think that is not something to be underestimated, particularly if we're talking about larger value chain projects. And then around the evaluating success, so there's a lot of the materials that I have are handouts from this donor committee for enterprise development, because it is really difficult to attribute changes in the market just to your intervention. And so how do you do that appropriately to look at number of jobs created, increases in production, business improvements writ large in the value chain. They have really rigorous indicators that you can incorporate into projects, which were really interesting. I did find it interesting that there's a ton of donors in this donor committee. USAID is not one of them. A lot of Europeans.
ILO.
Yes, well, of course, and the UN. but the U.S. government is not yet a partner or a party. So it's good to know, but it's not necessarily things that they're going to be like, oh, great, you use the DC indicators.
I mean, those are like jobs created. That's one of the key.
Yeah.
Pretty common that a lot of this is very similar to what standard indicators that they're at.
And I don't know if USAID has different indicators. How they
that's different.
Different question. But there's a lot of resources.
Very output oriented.
Right, and then that's the question is, are you just doing the direct delivery quick wins to get an output checkbox, but not really having the broader outcome? So I'm going to stop there. That's a really quick whirlwind, but I'm happy to answer questions and share more resources.
Thank you. I had a question actually, all the way back to your second slide on nomenclature, right? The supply chain versus value chain versus market systems development. And my question is, or a sort of decision point for us to think about as an agency, do we, by continuing to use the word ag value chain, or are we really branding ourselves as an NGO? And would we be more competitive, at least with our marketing materials or positioning with private sector, to use supply chain or market systems development or something else?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good question. It's something that also came up when I was in Vietnam, because we were talking with a couple other groups, and they said, we're really interested in resilient supply chains. And I was like, so are we. I'm not sure I would have said it that way, but so are we. Mm-hmm. So I agree. I mean, I think when we use value chain, we're definitely speaking development speak.
Yeah, which I think is okay. I mean, I would say my argument, I think we probably have the same experience when we go to the Specialty Coffee Association and you adapt your language for how they're talking. You talk about supply chains, but really as an NGO, we're not talking about just supplying the market. We're talking about our bot. So your earlier comment, we're working, the work that we're doing in any value chain isn't just so that more of that product is being produced. It's so that ultimately is going back to the farmer and helping improve their life. So I would not get stuck on should we change all of our language? I think that we just have, it's just like for any donor, basically, you adapt to their language, or you adapt to the context that you're working. I think as an organization, we don't want to change our mission.
You went way beyond what I was suggesting. I was not suggesting changing our mission.
No, sorry. I mean, when I say mission, I'm just saying
not changing the name of our ag value chain, even for marketing materials. So yesterday in a meeting that Daniel had debriefing on his trip to West Africa, he thinks that we need to have more money in our FY19 budget for marketing materials and for media and visibility. And so part of me is that means do we need to do a refresh? Our current ag value chain thing, should that be, if we're going to a meeting with, Land O'Lakes or someone or or McCormick or something, would be better off having a branded thing that says supply chain development, how we can help you with your supply chains, as opposed to value chain.
Sure, it depends on who your audience is, right? Yeah. But for a USAID donor, that kind of thing, it's still going to be ag value chain for or, and again, like I
We're
said,
talking
we've already,
private sector, yeah.
no, I know, but like we've already changed that language, like
Yeah.
a while ago. I don't know if like the written material, I
I
don't
would
know.
say, I don't think our technical profiles reflect a private sector orientation,
But they're also not geared at a private sector audience.
and maybe they should.
That's
Yeah, no.
that's my point, yeah.
Yeah, but I don't know that even a technical profile is, yeah, I mean, that's awesome. We've been asking for that for a while.
I know there's chats online as well, but let's see. How do you see LWR using this info? Yeah, that's a great question. How does it change what we're doing now or the way that we think is next? So within my region, I know so we have one project that's currently under development and design where I've been pushing back really strongly about based on this training and trying to get them to think about the broader market and whether where they're working is the most relevant for the impact level that they want to have. I think writ large, there's more discussion to be had about our approach, and I know that it might come up at the IPD Summit when we are talking about if we work in the entire value chain, where can we have the greatest impact? Does it make sense still to work on direct delivery to farmers if that's kind of an outdated model? And I don't myself assume that I speak for all of LWR when there was a lot about this that really appeals to me, and I think that we can have a broader impact by being more market oriented. But I recognize, as Carolyn said, that does require us to shift a little bit, where our intervention level is, and you can't always assume that just by working with, the exporters, the traders, that somehow you're also then improving life for the farmer.
Is this something that we could apply directly to the Nepal coffee project as like a pilot?
Why, yes. That's actually part of the conversation we've been having. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So, again, for my region, of course, they're getting a lot more probably than they want because I came back and I'm like, I'm so excited about this. And but in terms of LWR writ large, I think there is still sort of a question of the pace of change and also where we think kind of the future is. Obviously, there's still, I think, a lot of question marks about how do you continue to have these partnerships with the private sector and what is the actual return on investment for that relationship building long term. But I will say from the UN perspective, this training is very clear that they think the future is where the private sector is leading development and that they are the ones.
Are cooperatives considered the private sector?
I would say so if you're working with them as a business.
For me, I won't carry on this point because I think Carolyn was already getting there. Michael, as usual, is practical and down to earth and talking about some important tactics, which I would defer. But for me, this is a really key point. What is our mission and what is our institutional interest? And really, I don't see any monitoring and evaluation or even design exercises to make sure that when we do work, and I do believe the private sector is a key to sustainable development in many of the areas that we work, but I don't see any ways that we're making sure, and we're double and triple checking, that as we work in an ag value chain, that actually those pro-poor benefits, really, are really coming down in the way that we expected. This model assumes a way. It kind of assumes that there's a rule of law in a certain way, that the market works more or less okay. Yes, there's some marginalization, but that's on the margins, as opposed to the real world, where I'm assuming, the president's father-in-law, takes over the entire coffee export or import market, or until you pay the bribe, you're not getting anything, says the farmer. And so, that's why I think it's really important that we have those tools. And it's a check on ourselves. It's not necessarily how we present ourselves. I would be careful about having, a two-sided card or two cards in your wallet. I'm from the UN, and that's my black helicopter. But more seriously, it is one where I think there are many other organizations that just are not bothered with trying to come up with those, oh yes, the poor will benefit because the market will function better. But I think under those, there's many layers here. And black swan events, I'm reviewing another paper and using stupid economic language, but big bad things that can happen that are maybe rare, but they can totally throw all this out the window. Coffee rust, certain kinds of diseases, a change in president, etc. So you're saying, well, that's in the environment anyway. But for me, I don't see as we enter these value chains that kind of analysis in terms of those knock-on effects. And that, for me, I'm not saying it's a terrible concern, but it is one that as we get better at designing and monitoring. And the last point is on the policy and the advocacy. I think the more we can influence, frankly, help write the RFAs ourselves, or at least influence them so we're not given, we got to do this the way they said it. I mean, AID's history is they always want to create this mythical, unicorn, find a mythical middle-class farm community. And they have done some terrible things in trying to do that in the past. I'm not saying that. So for me, it's really important to think about those things as related. This is really helpful because it visualizes. But with Rick and Kenneth's support, I mean, Uganda is one of those environments where the market, doesn't always look like the building.
Yeah, can I do that? Because I think this is fascinating because this is exactly what we're talking about. No, I mean, when the country directors got together and talked about coffee and cocoa a couple weeks ago, and then we had the meeting like 2 weeks ago about our coffee cocoa strategy, and there's the reality, like coffee cocoa alone is never going to get, like with the current global commodities market, unless we can change that, it's never going to bring people out of poverty, like farmers out of poverty. That's just the reality. And I would say that that's probably true with the majority of value chains. One value chain, most likely, like working in just one, is not going to pull any of our farmers out of poverty unless you're talking about like, I don't know, some super high level, obviously there's examples, there's exceptions. And so that's what makes me a little bit nervous. I mean, I get the whole assessment and it's really important, but I think we have to be really careful about only like thinking about it as sort of the unicorn. Like cocoa and coffee is the unicorn, it's going to save the farmers. That's just not the reality.
Poor families more dependent on an international crop, and suddenly the rules of the international trade change, and where are they?
Or everybody's producing the same thing, and so then the prices go down. Or like there's just so many factors that play into it, and I imagine that was sort of part of the conversation as well. But it does make me nervous about yes, taking a market perspective, but also balancing that with like ultimately our mission is to help bring people out of poverty. And
hey Carolyn, this is Laura. I just wanted to jump in here if I could, because Rick Pizer and I were having this very conversation this morning, and I think Rick is on leave, so he wasn't able to participate in the seminar or our brown bag. But one of the things that we were talking about is if we were to do interventions with the private sector, one potential focus of LWR could be on income diversification. And that's, like much of the stuff that we're trying to do in Central America. But I think that's one way to work to bring farmers out of poverty. And that would be something that the companies might not be interested in, but that might be a good role for LWR. Do you have thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I would agree. I mean, we were, again, in the conversation that you were part of, Laura, a couple weeks ago, like I referred to, and using coffee as an example, like I use them as like the poster child, because they're really like, we put them out there because there's a lot of interest in them, but with the recognition that diversification is so important. And I think that's a really interesting point, Laura, is like, is that the role that we play? I mean, that's kind of, I don't know, so maybe it goes outside of the value chain analysis. But when they say that we really shouldn't be part of the market, I kind of agree with that. But what we can play is that role of helping to diversify incomes. And
well, Carolyn, I think that's really important. And this is someone.
Rick Pizer, yeah?
No.
Rick Kellett.
Oh, okay.
So I think that if we're going to see the diversification, there has to be a private sector player that does have an interest in it if it's going to be effective and sustainable. So, we can facilitate. I think it just goes back to the framework that Nicole was laying out here. Is what is the role of LWR? If it is going to be as a nonprofit actor in the sort of more traditional NGO way, then maybe it is as a facilitator to either identify another company that will come and work with the same farmer, or to enable the company that's already working with it to diversify into an additional value chain. And that's our ambition with our impact investing, is that we start with something like coffee. We build all of the relationships that are necessary, between the farmer and the market to generate value on more favorable terms to the farmer. And then we go and add another crop and another processing technology, and we use, we may have to develop more marketing for that product, but we've got some marketing acumen already because we developed it with coffee. You know, if we can sell it to the same end users, great.
You know, Rick,
That's
I would
the
agree.
approach the Clinton impact investing group was taken, where their focus, they start with
We lost some of what you said, Rick.
Most of the last.
Yeah. Still lost.
It's like a great topic of conversation for our ag
I was
summit.
gonna say.
Yeah. Great.
Well, fair.
You know what? And I've heard Myron mention this.
And I can finish the thought quickly. I mean, the Clinton folks have started with grocery stores, with supermarkets, and are targeting multiple crops and value chains to the same end retailer.
Rick, we can't hear you
Rick,
very
we
well.
lost you a little bit, but I do think we will continue the conversation.
Yeah.
Probably. Maybe, hopefully by April. I'll stick around in case Rick pops back online, but thanks guys.
Thanks,
Nicole.
Thank you.